Serious, Redditors who went to school with a kid that later became a serial murderer. Were they creepy even back then, or were you surprised when you heard the news? I went to school with a boy who shook his baby to death and then killed his girlfriend. He was always really weird, but he seemed harmless. I was honestly surprised. I went to school with a girl whose dad turned out to be a murderer. Not serial, so IDK if it counts. But he started dating one of his daughter's friends the day she turned 18. Married her, caught her cheating, killed them both, then killed himself. There were signs. He was always a possessive, creepy pervert. I feel bad his daughter had to deal with him. I lived next door to this kid who seemed completely normal. We played together all the time. His family was a bit religious and mine wasn't, but as a kid I didn't notice anything odd. We grew apart in high school. A few years after high school he met an older woman, late 30s when he was early 20s, and moved in with her and her 2 daughters, who were like 8 and 10. She came home from work and found that he'd stabbed them both to death and hung himself in the woods behind her home. Still fricks with me. Jesus Christ dude, that's horrible. I went to high school with a kid who was pulled over for drunk driving and underage drinking. The police officer told him to get home and let him off with a warning. He went home and grabbed a 30.06 hunting rifle and walked into the police station. The officer who let him off earlier walked out and was shot by the kid. The officer passed away on the flight to the hospital. The kid was 16-17 when he shot the officer and is still in prison 20 years later. The son of the officer who was shot lived a couple blocks away from me. Such a sad ordeal for both families. Just wow. Officer spared him but kid had no gratitude. However, I wonder if it was partly since he was drunk, but no excuse for his actions. Back in elementary school, there was a kid in my class who had horrible temper management. If he was upset, he would suddenly scream and kick or punch things around him. Violent tendencies. He transferred to a school in the US in middle school, but I found him on Facebook couple years later. He seemed to have become less childish and had lots of friends at his new school. Fast forward to college, my friend showed me an article of a student at a university in California who attempted to murder his roommate. Lo and behold, it was the kid in my class. He apparently stabbed his roommate in his sleep, survived eventually, and then slit his own throat, also survived. His police mugshot shows a huge gash wrapping around his neck, all stitched up. Last I read of him, he went to prison. Just read up on that. Was described as really athletic and super nice by one of his peers. Makes me wonder how many people are hiding behind masks like that. I was best friends with a girl who is in prison for killing her baby. She was a foster kid and that's how I knew her. My step-aunt was her foster mother. She would tell me about how her mom abused her physically and sexually growing up. Her mom also let men rape her for drug money. It bothered her but she seemed to be well adjusted and she always talked about wanting to have children. The doctors said her uterus was damages from being raped as a child but she got pregnant. I lost contact with her when she got married and was pregnant but I knew about it because my sister told me. I was really happy for her and just knew she'd be a good mom. Boy was I wrong. She had a daughter and apparently became very jealous of her. She hated it when people would focus their attention on her daughter and not her. Her husband decided that he was going to divorce her and they separated. They had joint custody, so on a weekend that he was supposed to have the baby, she brought her to him. The baby was lethargic, her eyes were shaking. He couldn't get the baby to respond to anything. Then she started having seizures. He rushed the baby to the hospital where she died. They did a scan on her brain and it was pretty much soup. The mom was angry about the separation and shook her. This girl was in child development class with me when our teacher was showing us what a baby's brain looks like after shaking baby syndrome. I had to leave the class because it was so horrific. She was sitting next to me when we saw it. I just couldn't believe. I couldn't sleep for weeks knowing that this person I once loved and considered an unofficial sister could do something like that. My step-aunt who fostered her and gave her a chance was hysterical. It was just all around awful. Reading this messed me up. I went to school with Susan Smith, who drowned her 3 kids in South Carolina. She was always normal, didn't seem like the type to do something like that. 2 kids, Alex and Michael. That story haunts me to this day. I went to school with a boy who turned out to be planning a terrorist attack on the school. He was caught before he carried anything out, and was one of the youngest to be charged with terrorism. He was shy and quiet but very smart. Got a full scholarship to Hopkins. He threw it all away, not only for him but for his brother that had been dreaming of working for the government. No way he will get a clearance now, with a convicted terrorist as a brother. Assuming you are from the USA, this is one of the things that weird me out about the USA or any other country really. I know, yes he is a brother, but why does he has to become victim of his brother's actions? I went to school and hung around a girl that murdered her baby. To sum it up, she had a baby in high school. The kid was taken away around 8 months due to brain damage from abuse. She got pregnant after that, like she was a tiny girl and was clearly pregnant and kept denying it. Her and her boyfriend had no intentions on raising this baby and planned to murder it. Baby was born, they stabbed it in the heart and burned the body. Her social workers noticed her huge bump was gone and called the cops. Cops found what was left. Found a lot of search history on her laptop that made it clear she'd been planning the murder for months. It was shocking that it happened but not super shocking. I mean, she did abuse her first child. Her and her boyfriend were drug users, and when we hung around in school she'd show pictures of her baby yet always seemed so disconnected when you'd ask her anything about the baby. Honestly, it's been like 10 years and no one knows why they killed this baby. She could have had an abortion for free but chose this instead. She ended up blaming her boyfriend for everything. He got max, she got 30 months and had since gotten out and had another son. I think she missed that class on how babies are made. I went to school with a guy who murdered his girlfriend and his parents. He was always in butthole, even as a kid. He was a bully and just verbally mean to most everyone. That also made him kind of a cool kid, so he did have friends, so he wasn't an outcast. That being said, I never would have thought he'd become a killer. As far as I know, he doesn't even have a bad home life, history of abuse story that helps explain why he is the way he is. I think he is just a fundamentally broken person. I just thought he was a jerk. I had no idea how deep it went. Last I checked, he was in prison for life, so I guess that's that. There was a guy in my class who tried robbing a fast food chain restaurant. He used to work there, and the girl he stabbed was a manager that he had clashes with in the past. Stabbed her as he was trying to force his way in, got the money, and before walking out, turned around and stabbed her up to a total of 8 times. I remember him being a bit of a punk but not murdering kind of punk. I remember him being a bit of a punk but not murdering kind of punk. Most drugs won't do that to you, but some can absolutely push you past the edge like that, especially if you have a mental disorder or are prone to mental illness because of genetics. Regular use of M and similar crap can just fry your brain to the point that things that don't make sense start making sense. Turns out one of my friends, chilled consistently from middle school into young adulthood, ended up killing at least one person after taking them home from a bar. He was at my wedding, but we fell out of touch a few years before this stuff happened. It was a goddamn shock. BC, I had no sense of him being a bad dude at all. Not necessarily murder, but definitely complete indifference. I went to high school with one of the fraternity brothers from Penn State who let a pledge die of alcohol poisoning on the couch in their frat house. They wouldn't take him to the hospital and let him lay dying while they partied on. They all got off with a slap on the wrist. He was always super chill, nice, and good looking. I was really surprised to hear that he had a role in what happened to that kid, considering we went to a military school. There was this kid that would get bullied regularly in high school. He was silent, a bit weird, wouldn't really talk much even if you did try to converse with him. But then one day he snapped, stabbing his parents before school, killing his father and stabbing his mother numerous times. Survived. She managed to call the police. They picked him up on the bus on his way to school and found on him a knife and list of all the people he was planning kill in school. Sydney, Australia, Oak Hill High School. He wasn't on the bus. His mum called police and they found him in his home. Still super creepy. He claimed mental illness as a defense and said he heard the voice of the devil. Not sure if it counts, because I didn't know the kid too well in high school. Recently got a bunch of messages saying, "Do you remember buddy? He just killed a girl and her kids." Only memory of him I had was that he was very hot-headed. Turns out he went into a blind rage, murdered his girlfriend and her 2 kids. One kid made it because she was at a driving lesson and not in the house. Jesus, I think I know that story. Brutal. Happened literally down the street from my friend's house. Said the kids and wife were super nice. OHH. Good times. Went to school with a kid who was always an butthole to me. Giant butthole. Like as in my worst enemy ever in my life that I hated with a passion butthole. The kid bullied me for years. One time he even randomly punched me in the face during a game of basketball in middle school. Stole things from people. Lied about everything. My freshman year of high school rolls around and in pay, this kid jokingly pulls a knife on me and talks about cutting my balls off. I figured, hey, I'm gonna go tell on him because he'll probably get written up and get a few detentions. Welp, no, he gets kicked out of the school. For 2 years, anytime anyone runs into him, they make sure to let me know that he said that if he ever sees me again, he is going to actually kill me. Welp. After many lost sleep nights in those 2 years, the death threats stop making their way to me and he kinda just disappears. My senior year of high school, I run into this kid. This kid has put on some serious mass and I walk past him like I didn't know him. 2 weeks later, he is arrested for murder. So it turns out, here's what happened from his timeline. All was announced later as he was a minor when this all had happened. This kid gets kicked out of school. He decides that it's a good idea to start trying to steal cars to make money. So him and 2 friends go steal cars and hold people at gunpoint. One was above 18, so he got 10 years in prison. Murder dude was 16 and his friend, who was also 16, testifies against him for being the wielder of the gun. Murder dude gets 2 years in big boy prison while his friend, or now former friend, gets a year of probation. While this kid is in prison, he tells everyone that he is going to murder his former friend. Well, less than a week out of prison, the time frame that I saw him, he murders the kid by stabbing him 26 times, pulls the kid's teeth out of his dead body to hide dental records, and puts the dead body in a blanket and sets it on fire in the middle of the woods. Then texts his new buddy to let him know that the murder was finished. Welp. Police caught him right away, as he told everyone that he was going to commit a murder. And he had text messages proving his guilt, so he is now serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Not one bit of me is surprised, though part of me feels awful for getting him kicked out of school. I really didn't mean to do that. Now here's the thing. Is anyone surprised that he committed this murder? Not at all. If I ever met one person in my life who was capable of murder, it was this kid. This kid was the absolute definition of an butthole. Just the most awful kid. Now that being said, his home life was crap, and for that, I feel bad for him. But to be fair though, him going to prison for life was the most mentally relieving thing to ever happen to me. Shouldn't feel bad for getting them kicked out. I went to school with a guy who was rumored to be gang affiliated. For the sake of the story we'll call him Jay. I didn't believe them at first because the guy was a total clown. However, around the time 8th grade started, Jay started writing really creepy poetry in our literature class. Lots of cryptic references to gun violence, death, etc. His personality also started changing. Jay was really hostile towards other students, disobedient in class, and started getting into fights outside of school. It was very disturbing, but amazingly enough, none of my teachers ever talked to him about the content of his work, his behavior, or brought it up to his parents. I wish they had, because maybe they could have gotten him help before it was too late. Eventually we graduated and I didn't see him anymore. 10 years later, I see his face plastered all over the local news. As it turns out, he was in fact a gang member and was wanted for shooting a man to death outside of local park in downtown. Jay turned himself in 12 hours after the shooting. The truly sad part is that Jay didn't even kill his intended target. He got him mixed up with an innocent man who was cutting through the park to get home. It was unbelievably tragic. The guy Jay killed was a recent college graduate with a wife and 2 kids. This man had his whole life ahead of him and it got taken away from him because of some stupid gang bulls that had nothing to do with him. If that wasn't bad enough, there was actually a string of similar murders, about 17, that occurred in the months prior to the shooting. All of the previous murders played out similarly, late at night, in secluded areas, and all victims were killed via drive-by shooting. Jay and his crew are currently the prime suspects in all of these murders. Last I heard they were all in custody and awaiting trial. I hope they all get put away for life. So many reasons a gang is freaking stupid, this being the main one of them. My oldest best friend dated a guy through middle school and high school. They broke up because he was getting into drugs. He was just sentenced to life in prison for shooting a man in the head and burning his body in a barrel. Not serial, but still crazy. He was always the shy, quiet but very nice kid. Went elementary and junior high with this one kid. He was very quiet, had 2 younger brothers and they only hung out with each other. You never saw him have any other friends, just his brothers. I don't recall him ever talking to anyone unless they spoke to him first. He was never picked on or bullied, we all just sort of left him to himself. We didn't go to the same high school, so I never saw him again until I was in university and watching the news. He was surrounded by cops and being handcuffed because he was kicked out of a bar, went home, got a shotgun, came back and killed the owner who had booted him. On a side note, years later I wound up working with the bar owner's friend, who was there that night and was a pallbearer. Small world. Went to elementary school with a boy who had some anger and learning issues. I think he really wanted to be good and kind but couldn't help but to act out. 2 years ago he killed his mother, they got into a fight and he beat her. He punched and stomped on her multiple times, then called 911. She was taken to the hospital where she later passed away. He pled guilty in court against his lawyer's advice. Apparently he told the police when they arrived to lock him up for life. He told the court he just snapped. I imagine he feels extreme guilt and remorse about his actions. I grew up with a guy who ended up going to prison for a particularly nasty murder. He was a goth kind of guy who was into that weird techno type metal stuff. Nin, Ministry, Thrill Kill Cult, etc. Honestly, he was always a great dude. He drank a lot and smoked a lot of weed, which I wasn't a big fan of, but he was the oldest friend in the group and handled himself pretty well. He was also normally the one who would volunteer to help drunk friends to the toilet, hold their hair while they threw up, etc. A lot of times, we were at his and his GF's place. He probably didn't want vom on the carpet. One day, my friend calls me. We were maybe 18. She was like, turn on the fricking news. There was our dude's mugshot. He and 2 other guys were arrested for beating a kid to death with a chain, stealing his ATM card, stuffing the dead guy's body in the trunk of his own car, stealing the car and driving around with the body for a week. We were stunned. He did not seem like someone who would do that. Nothing even close to it. There were some real weirdos in our group. He did not strike any of us as one of them. He was initially going to get the death penalty, but the victim's parents didn't want that. So life in prison with no parole for murder, numerous theft charges, and gross abuse of a corpse. Jesus. I was just thinking this reminded me of a story my fiance told me. In high school, a kid who I think was in a grade above me, maybe not, was arrested for the rape and murder of his girlfriend's 2-year-old daughter. It was done while he was babysitting her and the mom was at work. I think the baby passed away at the hospital, but I'll have to look it up. He was a really weird guy who I never actually spoke to but would see in the halls and had friends who knew him. I went to school with a guy that shot his 1-year-old daughter in front of the mother his girlfriend cause he thought she was cheating. It was the saddest thing ever. She was a really quiet, nice girl and he was a total weirdo who hung out with a small group of goth kids. I went to school with a guy who would drug and rape girls with his dad. I didn't know him, but he seemed kind of weird, but maybe that's hindsight. He wasn't necessarily a serial murderer, just a murderer. Anyways, he was a punk rock skater kid we hung out with quite a bit. He was kinda on the lower economic side, but frankly we all kinda were in the group. After high school he got addicted to H pretty bad, so he moved to Reno to stay with his grandma to get away from his drug friends and one night ended up getting really high at his grandma's and relapsed. His grandma found him and berated him so he choked her to death. He then threw her corpse in the trunk of her car and drove back to our town and buried her in his mom's backyard. What was weird for me was I was working at a pizza shop and he came in probably 2 days before he was arrested driving a car that later I found out was his grandma's. He was acting kinda odd, but he always was a little weird so I didn't think much of it. A little late, but this guy I knew all through my school career. Football player with like scholarships and crap I think. Was driving drunk and made an illegal right turn. Ran over an 8-year-old girl and kept driving. In front of her parents. He ended up getting off scot-free and going back to college football I think. From I remember, most people supported him through it even though it was a hit and run under the influence and his mother turned him in for something. I used to have to walk past that memorial in town on my way to work. Still gets me steamed. Didn't he go to school with him but definitely knew him growing up. His family lost everything scamming people. He got involved with the cartels killing and disposing of bodies. He was a nice guy with a can-do attitude. Apparently when he got arrested he was really professional at his job. Went to high school with a guy that stabbed a guy to death last year because of a personal beef. Not surprised in any single way. He once stabbed an elderly security guard at a local gym. So this was a natural progression. Went to school with a guy who was kind of a class clown. He was goofy and made a lot of jokes but performed well in classes and was never mean. About a year after I graduated he was buying weed off a guy and apparently the dealer was trying to rip him off so he ran him over with his truck and killed him. Ruined his life over like $100 bucks in weed. That had to be a bad batch of weed. I went to a Christian university and while we were on fall break, one of the undercover gay kids that went there went home and killed his parents. Bonus points for guessing the school and the kid. That's the week I learned that the Texas Rangers were a real thing and not just a TV show. Guy was gay at a pretty conservative school and that always raised a couple of eyebrows but outside of that, it was completely unthinkable that anyone I knew was capable of that. I'm late to this thread and this will probably be buried, but I was in the same high school graduating class as Zohar Tsarnaev, the younger of the Boston Bombers. We were on friendly but not close terms at high school, but learning of his involvement in the attack was a huge surprise. That whole week was surreal. I had friends in the crowd at the marathon, but none of them near the finish line when the bombs exploded. I was still living in the area, and was woken up on Friday to a text from a friend saying oh my god Zohar. The only thing I assumed from that was that it came out he was hurt in the bombing. Never in a million years would I have guessed he was involved. I remember feeling so angry at the attacks that whole week, up until finding out it was him, and that anger turned into grief stronger than I had ever felt before. I was seeing my classmates and friends on national TV, seeing my high school talked about by strangers in comment sections, reading such terrible things about my peers and teachers. I went through stages of denial, anger, and sadness before finally accepting that someone I had called a friend could do something so awful. On the Friday of the manhunt, I was just outside the radius that was roped off by SWAT teams. I know people that were woken up by federal officers at their upstairs windows. When they found Zohar in the boat Friday night, I could hear the gunfire from my house and knew to turn on the TV again. I often wonder where all their hate came from. It makes me question a lot about the city I grew up in, that I still call home. I taught in a school with kids who had behavior disorders. Future killers learn math somewhere. I've known kids who have killed peers, killed other people's babies, killed their own babies, killed themselves. The most notable one was the girl who killed her mom in a foreign country. During staffing meetings with everyone who works with the kid, the mom was counseled several times to call the police on her daughter, that the abuse she was suffering at her daughter's hands was going to kill her someday. None of us were surprised by the news. We were all saddened for everyone. Any of the kids I've worked with were capable of killing someone, some more than others, but every day you hope and pray that they can get their crap together and see that there's a different way to live. It's like watching a plane nosedive. You're crossing your fingers that they pull out of it and make it to safety. Some do and some don't. Went to school with a kid that was always having accidents. He poured model airplane fuel on a campfire and burned his hands and face. Knocked his sister down a flight of stairs and left her there overnight till her mom left for work and found her. He went to juvie in 8th grade for breaking into a school and trashing it in juvie. Several kids died under mysterious circumstances. After he got out he went train hopping and was arrested later for killing homeless people while robbing them. The one person that still lives in the town I go up in that I talk to says he confessed to many more murders while in prison, but I don't know if he was bullcrapping or not. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.